volunteers here at the fort. And I do presentations on the 19th century when this was an American fort. And we're going to be talking about an era at the end of the 19th century that's called the Golden Age of St. Augustine. And I like starting with this picture taken from upstairs on the gun deck. If you go up on the gun deck today and you look to the west, this is what you'll see. You'll see the grounds around the fort and the tree line over across the street with the two towers of our parking garage. But if you had been here in 1885 and gone up on the gun deck and had that same view, you'd have seen this. The San Marco Hotel, one of the original true Florida resort hotels. It was 6 stories high, wood frame, had steam elevators to take you and your belongings up to the top floor and back down. Each room had gas heating and gas lighting, and at the end of the hallways, they had bathrooms. Hey, you come to Florida and not have to go to an outhouse. How cool is that, right? Well, one of the men that came and stayed at the San Marco Hotel in the winter of 1885 was a man named Henry Flagler. Mr. Flagler was a very wealthy man. He was wealthy because he was partners with a man named John D. Rockefeller in a company called the Standard Oil Company. And if you don't know what Standard Oil was, it was the biggest corporation in the world. It has since been broken up by the antitrust laws of the United States, and what was Standard Oil is today ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, and Marathon. So imagine being one of the primary shareholders in all of those companies, wound up in one called Standard Oil, at a time when you did not have to pay one thin dime in federal income tax. At the time of his death, his net worth was estimated to be 1/650th of the gross national product of the United States. That's a lot of greenbacks. And he had a lot of very wealthy friends. This was during the Industrial Revolution. And at that time, industry was booming, corporations were growing, and millionaires were being made. And a new class of citizen was coming on the scene called the leisure class, or the upper crust. These were people that didn't have to work for a living. They would summer in Newport, or up in the Adirondacks, or on Lake Champlain. But they had no place to go during the winter because it was cold up north. Well, Henry Flagler saw St. Augustine, fell in love with its Spanish heritage, and he decided he was going to turn St. Augustine into what he called the winter Newport, or the American Riviera. He used both terms. And in order to do that, he hired a young man that was only 26 years old to be his chief architect. His name was Thomas Hastings. And Flagler commissioned Thomas Hastings to design for him a world-class hotel to put here in St. Augustine. And what Thomas Hastings gave him was the Ponce de Leon, one of the great hotels of all time. Unlike the other hotels in town that were wood framed, this was the largest poured-in-place concrete structure in North America and the second largest in the world. They took this same rock that the fort is made out of, this coquina stone. It's quarried out across the bay on Anastasia Island. And they would take crushed coquina, mix it with Portland cement and sand, and turn it into a concrete mixture. And then they laid down what they called a floating foundation for this hotel. In some places, the concrete is 20 feet thick to hold the weight of this building. Once the foundation dried, they put a wood frame 4 feet high around the perimeter, and they poured a 4-foot wall of concrete. When it dried, they raised the frames, they poured another 4 feet, then another, then another. That's what's called poured-in-place concrete. It took between 450 and 600 men working 6 days a week, almost 2 full years to complete this hotel. And Thomas Hastings, the architect, also decided to have these 2 towers built in. Not just because they were beautiful and had a great view of the ocean, which they did, but they also served a purpose. Each of those 2 towers contained 2 4,000-gallon water tanks. Flagler had an artesian well dug on site. They went down 1,490 feet. Flagler actually wanted the well to go down 2,000 feet, but the drill bit broke. So 1490 was as deep as they got. Give me just a moment, let the drummer get by, and we'll continue with the presentation. That's the one thing about on big weekends where we got a lot of soldados here to do the cannon firing. We always come up with somebody to be the cannon or the drummer boy also. Come on, one more. went down with the well they built. The artesian well was 1,490 feet deep. It had enough water pressure. It had an opening. It was a foot in diameter. Had enough water pressure that it shot water 20 feet up into the air and provided 7,000 gallons of water a minute. Now, Thomas Hastings, the architect, had a brother who happened to be one of the directors for the Thomas Edison Company. And so through that connection, he designed the hotel with electricity in place. It had over 26 miles of electric wiring and over 2,000 electric light bulbs. But the Edison Company also provided them with 3 dynamo generators that would require 8,000 pounds of coal per day, and also a custom-made for him a water pump, a steam water pump to pump water from that artesian well up into these 2 towers. And that will provide water pressure, much like the water tower in your city provides water pressure for your home. When the hotel opened in January of 1888, it had the bathrooms at the end of the hallway, just like any other good hotel of the time did, with one exception. In the other hotels, you had to have maids bring up buckets of water to fill the tub or fill the sink. In this hotel, you open the taps. Hot and cold running water and flushing toilets, something that was brand new at the time. Within 5 years, they would convert 50 of the rooms to have in-suite bathrooms, something else that was brand new. And by the turn of the 20th century, every room would have a private or a semi-private bath. But Flagler knew that he was going to bring the rich and famous to come down to St. Augustine for the winter. And that's what they would do. They wouldn't just come for a week or a month. They came for the winter, from early January until after Easter. But he knew he'd have to give them something beautiful inside as well. So he hired another young man from New York who had just opened his own business in interior decorating to come down here and be the interior designer for the Ponce de Leon Hotel. His name was Louis Comfort Tiffany. And this is what Tiffany gave Flagler. That's the dining room at the Ponce de Leon Hotel. Some of the earliest Tiffany stained glass anywhere in the world, and it is absolutely priceless. But Flagler had a problem. Getting to St. Augustine in the 1880s was not easy. This is a map from a tourist guide from the 1800s called Whitney's Florida Pathfinder, and it shows a map of St. Johns County with St. Augustine here and Jacksonville up there. And notice that they are separated by the St. Johns River. Well, there were no bridges across the St. Johns River. You could get to Jacksonville by train, but to get to St. Augustine, you had to get off the train and take a riverboat, a steamboat, down the St. Johns River to the dock at Decoy, where you would then go to what's called the St. Johns Railway, which is basically a trolley line with a steam locomotive to bring you into town. Well, this wasn't good enough for Henry Flagler, so he went into the railroad business. He bought up the right-of-way of a narrow-gauge railroad called the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Line. He built a railroad bridge across the St. Johns River at Jacksonville and turned this into a standard gauge railroad. See any money going into this project yet? Yeah. This guy's poured millions of dollars into this. The railroad bridge was completed in December of 1889, just in time for the 1890 winter season, and that would be the 3rd season the Ponce de Leon was open. So starting in January of 1890, the rich and famous that were going to come to St. Augustine to spend the winter would gather in Manhattan in the cold of January right after New Year's. They had to take a ferry boat across the Hudson River to Jersey City, New Jersey, because that's where Pennsylvania Station was for all points south. They'd get into their Pullman cars and sit back and relax. The train would leave Pennsylvania Station and get up to the rip-roaring speed of 40 miles an hour. And 36 hours later, it would arrive at Union Depot in St. Augustine, to 70-degree weather, palm trees, ocean breezes, paradise. Waiting for them to be these horse-drawn carriages to take them to Mr. Flagler's hotel. And when you see the horse-drawn carriages lined up along the bayfront here in the evening, those are reminiscent of the time that Mr. Flagler brought them here to serve the rich and famous that were staying in his hotels. From the train station, which is out where US 1 is today, there's actually a fire station on the site today. Flagler paved Valencia Street to lead into the back entrance of the Ponce de Leon Hotel through what's called the carriageway. These were Victorian-era socialites. They didn't want to go in through the front door while they're still in their travel attire. They didn't want to have a chance to freshen up before being presented to society. So the carriages would take them into the lobby through the back door. And they'd walk into that lobby, they'd see that hand-laid mosaic tile floor with that hand-carved woodwork all the way around the room, with a row of light bulbs all the way around the mezzanine. They'd look up and they'd see that gold dome with George Maynard's masterpiece mural, Adventure, Discovery, Conquest, and Civilization. The men would reach into their pockets, they'd squeeze their wallets, and they'd say, I wonder how much this is going to cost. Because it would cost a lot. For one of those 50 rooms with the in-suite baths to come and stay for the entire winter season would be $4,000, room and board for the husband, the wife, and the maid, because most of them brought their maids with them. In today's money, that's about $100,000 to stay at a hotel for 3.5 months. Well, while the men checked in, the ladies would be escorted to the ladies' parlor for tea, because under Victorian-era standards, it was considered unseemly for the ladies to be at the front desk while the men were discussing money matters. My personal view, the men didn't want to tell their wives they were spending $4,000 on the room, but that's just me. But the men would check in, the ladies would go for tea. The elevators, they had hydraulic elevators for the porters to take their belongings up to their room. The maids would lay out the clothing, and then the ladies would be escorted upstairs. But Flagler also knew that if he was going to bring the rich and famous down here for the entire winter, he had to give them entertainment as well. So across the street, he built another hotel that he called the Alcazar. It was also designed by his architect, Thomas Hastings, and done in poured-in-place concrete using coquina as the aggregate. This hotel would have a casino, it had tennis courts, a bowling alley, a shopping arcade, it had a spa that had a massage room, a Russian bath, a Turkish bath, a cold bath, and the world's largest indoor swimming pool that was available to everybody that was staying at the Ponce de Leon Hotel. Well, while Flagler's building these two hotels, another man in town decides he's going to get in on the act. His name was Franklin Smith. He was a retired grocer from Boston. He was a millionaire. He had moved down here in 1883 and built his own home that he called Villa Zareta. He was an amateur architect, and he dabbled in different building materials. This is the guy that came up with the idea of taking crushed coquina, mixing it with Portland cement and sand to make a brand with it. Well, when Franklin Smith saw Flagler building two hotels, he bought an adjoining piece of property, and he built a hotel. And he called it the Casa Monica. Unfortunately, he would go bankrupt while building it and have to sell out to Flagler for $325,000. But it is the only one of the three that is a hotel today. It is the Hotel Casa Monica down on King Street. It's got some lovely shops along the street front there. Several very nice art galleries, including a Coleman's Art Gallery, a high-end jewelry store, and a very nice Starbucks where you can sit out on the deck and watch the tourists walk by. But I recommend while you're in town, you take a walk through the lobby of the Casa Monica, since it has been here since 1888. Well, while this is going on in the south side of town, let's walk up to the north side of town for a minute. This is the first photograph ever taken of our city gates, taken at the end of the American Civil War by a Union Army photographer named Sam Cooley. You see what disrepair our city gates were in. Well, that's the way the whole city was. This was just an old, beat-up, run-down Spanish colonial town that had been in disrepair for half a century or so. We didn't even have any streets. We had dirt roads and no sidewalks. But if you had looked through those city gates in 1887, and that's while Mr. Flagler was building his two hotels on the south side of town, you'd have seen this. Warden Villa. William Warden was another partner in the Standard Oil Company. He saw what Flagler was doing here with building hotels, and he decided he was going to come down and build his own winter mansion here. And William Warden would winter here at this mansion every winter for the rest of his life. When he died, his children took it over, and they would winter there every year until the last of his children died in 1927. The building then sat vacant for 14 years until 1941, when a lady named Marjorie Kenyon Rawlins purchased it. She was a famous author. She had written the book The Yearling, which had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1941. And she was married to a man from Ocala who was a hotelier. And they bought it, they turned it into a hotel they called Castle Warden. And that is where the literary set would come whenever they'd come to St. Augustine. They'd stay at Castle Warden. And one man that came and stayed at that hotel quite frequently during the 1940s was, by all accounts, the most traveled man in the world. In the 1940s, there were 235 known countries in the world, and this guy had been to 201 of them. His name was Robert Ripley. Mr. Ripley was a cartoonist. He had cartoons in every Hearst newspaper called Ripley's. See, he's still famous today. But he fell in love with this hotel and he wanted to buy it. He had collected a lot of very odd things during his travels around the world, and he wanted a place where he could display them, what he would call an auditorium, O-D-D-atorium. But she would never sell to him. Finally, in 1949, Robert Ripley got one of the very first television shows when television was brand new. Ripley's Believe It or Not, broadcast live from New York with a live audience. And in the 13th episode, that magic number 13 for anybody as odd as Robert Ripley, while on stage, during the broadcast, he had a heart attack, believe it or not. Believe it or not. Come on guys, throw me a bone here. But he got through the broadcast, they took him to the hospital. 3 days later in the hospital, he had a massive coronary and died without ever being able to buy this hotel from Miss Keenan Rollins. However, the next year in 1950, the heirs to his estate did, and they turned it into the first Ripley's Believe It or Not museum in the United States. And it's right around the corner from the fort here at the very first traffic light. Done what's called Moorish Revival style of architecture, which was the same style of architecture that Franklin Smith used in building Villa Zareta, which is down on the south side of town. It became a very, very popular architectural style in Florida for the next half century or so. Well, during this post-Civil War era, sports were becoming very big in the United States, and Mr. Flagler was always looking for new forms of entertainment for his guests. And one thing that he noticed was that on the grounds of the fort here, they had put a baseball diamond. And it turns out that the different hotels had waiters that formed baseball teams. And they would come and play intramural baseball, one hotel against the other. And all the people that were staying in the hotels would come and stand on the sidelines and cheer for their teams. Well, Flagler saw this, and he decided that he was going to hire a man named Al Spalding of the Spalding Sporting Goods Company to come down and build him a stadium where he could bring spring training baseball. One of the teams that was one of the hotel teams that were the waiters here was called the Cuban Giants. They were the waiters at the Ponce de Leon Hotel. And this is their team picture, taken upstairs, or taken on the gun deck of the fort here. So outside the fort here, so you notice the fort in the background. They would, during the off-season, they would go up north and they would play different teams around the country up north, and they became very good. In fact, one of them, named Frank Grant, has actually been inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. But Flagler brought, when he started the stadium here, the stadium was completed in 1890, and he brought in the American Association Championship team, the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, to do spring training here. And this is their team picture taken upstairs on the gun deck of the fort by the tower up here. They were called the Bridegrooms because 7 of them were engaged to be married at the same time. But they kept the name for about 10 years. That year, while they were here, they switched over to the National League. And they won the pennant in the National League that year. They are still the only team to win back-to-back pennants in 2 different leagues. But after being the Bridegrooms for about 10 years, they changed their name to the Brooklyn Superbas after a Broadway show by that name. And then in 1910, a man named Charlie Ebbets bought the controlling interest of the team. And since they played at Eastern Park in Brooklyn, which was right next to a trolley station, and they had trolley cars running on both sides of the stadium, and you had to dodge the trolleys to get to the stadium, they changed their name to the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers. 3 years later, they dropped the trolley, so the team that won the National League pennant last year, the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the year before, may win it this year, can trace their National League roots back to this, their first team picture, taken in 1890 on the gun deck of the fort here, where they were the Brooklyn Bridegrooms. Another game that was becoming very popular in the late 1800s was a game that came across the pond from Scotland called golf. The first golf course in the state of Florida opened on February 27th of 1895. And that golf course was the grounds around this fort. It was a 3-hole golf course, par 3. You played 3 times around for around 9 holes of golf. The ladies liked to play too. The initial membership of the St. Augustine Golf Club had 200 members, and 70 of them were the ladies. They filled the moat with water to turn it into a water hazard for the golf course. It had always been a dry moat during the colonial period. It would be a golf, oh, and also Flagler saw this, and he built his own golf course on the south side of town, which would have this tee called the Tower Tee. And it was a 9-hole course that they called the Little Links, but it is since gone. But this golf course here around the fort would be a golf course for 30 years until 1925. Unfortunately, the year that the golf course started, tragedy hit the city. It was on March 28th, a month after the golf course opened. It was a Thursday afternoon as people were going back to work after their lunch break. They began to smell smoke in the air. They didn't know where it was coming from. Well, the old Forge, which was a blacksmith shop down on Charlotte Street. Charlotte Street's 1 block off the bayfront. The old Forge had caught fire, and it had been here since the 1700s. By the end of the day, it had burned down most of the city. There's a picture of St. Augustine taken from the fort here looking south along the bayfront. The fire would destroy 66 buildings. 40 of them were private residences, 2 of them cigar factories. It would take about a decade to rebuild after this particular fire. Fortunately, that day the winds were blowing from the south and the west, so the fire did not get as far to the south as the Plaza of the Constitution, where we have our cathedral, and did not get as far to the west as St. George Street, which is the main thoroughfare for the tourist industry here in town now, because it had a lot of old Spanish colonial era homes down on St. George Street. In fact, you can still see some of those old Spanish colonial era homes today. If you walk down St. George Street, one of the buildings you're going to see is this one here. When this picture was taken, it was called the St. Augustine Art Glass Store. It's just reopened as a new restaurant that is a crepe restaurant, Mimi's Crepes, I believe it's called, right across from the Bowling Crown Pub. This is the same building back in 1905 when it was called Dodge's Old Curiosity Shop. It was actually built as the Rodriguez family home in 1803. You see, this is another one with this orange balcony here down on St. George Street. Same building in 1894. But notice that by 1894, they'd begun to pave the streets of St. Augustine. Well, the city didn't have the money to pave the street with asphalt the way Mr. Flagler was doing around his hotels. And frankly, the city was too cheap to buy bricks. So somebody came up with the bright idea of paving the streets of St. Augustine with wood. They graded the streets, laid down wooden planking, and they built a machine that cut cypress into 6-inch round wooden pavers that were 6 inches deep, which they'd lay on top of the planks and fill in around them with sand. And this is what it looked like going in down on the Plaza of the Constitution. They thought they were saving the taxpayers a lot of money. It was a terrible idea. There are several things they did not take into consideration. First thing that they didn't consider is the fact that the rich and famous ladies that were staying at Mr. Flagler's hotels were wearing a new fashion accessory, high heels. And high heels in these streets did not get along together at all. And the ladies started complaining to Mr. Flagler that they were breaking their heels trying to navigate the streets of the city. Second thing they didn't take into consideration is that the horses that draw the horse-drawn carriages do their business on the streets. And would soak down through that sand, hit that wooden planking, and have no place to go. Let's just say after a rainstorm, it would get rather odoriferous downtown, if you know what I mean. But the most important thing they didn't take into consideration is the fact that cypress floats. September 1894, hurricane number 4 of the season crosses the state from Tampa to Jacksonville at the slow speed of 6 miles an hour, flooding everything in its path. It floods the streets of St. Augustine for 3 days. By the time it finally moves away, it has picked up all of these pavers. They're out in the bay, they're in people's yards, they're out in the orange groves, they're everywhere but on the streets. So the city finally decided that it was time that they reached into the city coffers and came up with the money to buy bricks. And you can still walk down some of those original brick streets today. When you leave the fort and head south, instead of taking the bayfront, you go to that first street in, which is Charlotte Street. You're going to walk in this old, rutted brick street. A couple of the side streets are the same way. You got to watch where you step to keep from tripping over your own feet. There's some on the south side of the plaza also. But those are the original brick streets that were put in after the hurricane of 1894 washed away our wooden streets. The best picture we have of the city after rebuilding from the Great Fire of 1895 is this one taken around 1912 from the gun deck of the fort. You still see the golf course here in the foreground. But they rebuilt in a Victorian era style of home instead of in a Spanish style. And some of those houses are still down there today as the bed and breakfast, the cigar emporiums, and a couple of restaurants in the first couple of blocks off the bayfront there. The Flagler era finally came to an end on May 20th of 1913 when Mr. Flagler died. By that time, he had moved down to Palm Beach, where he built his mansion, Whitehall, also designed by his architect, Thomas Hastings. Today, it is the Flagler Museum, a beautiful museum, a lot of absolutely fantastic Victorian-era furnishings right on the bay there. But on March 15th, he was walking down some stairs to a bathroom, somehow lost his footing, fell down the stairs onto a marble floor and broke his hip. And he would lay there for several hours before any of the servants noticed that he was missing. When they found him, they took him to a beachside cottage where he would linger for 2 months before he finally died. But by the time of his death on May 20th of 1913, he had taken that little railroad, that Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River line that he purchased to bring people to St. Augustine, and he had turned it into the Florida East Coast Railroad. He built the railroad down to Palm Beach, where he built the Royal Ponciana Hotel and the breakers out on the ocean. The Royal Ponciana was the largest wood frame structure in the world. It had over 1,000 rooms. But in 1928, when we hit by the Okeechobee hurricane of 1928, which actually shifted it off of its foundation, they finally tore it down 5 years later. He then built the railroad even further south to a little village called Fort Dallas. People of Fort Dallas were so happy that he was bringing the railroad and going to build a resort hotel in their village, they decided to incorporate it as a city and name it Flagler. Mr. Flagler politely declined and recommended that the Indians name their new city after the Indians that had been there before the settlers arrived. And they agreed and incorporated it as the city of Miami. He then built the railroad even further south, all the way to Key West, over what was called the Overseas Railroad, or the Homestead to Key West extension. It would take Flagler 7 years and cost him $30 million to build this extension from Homestead to Key West. And it was fraught with peril the entire way. It would be hit by 3 hurricanes during its construction. The first one destroyed most of his equipment and killed 125 of his workers. The newspapers started calling it Flagler's Folly. But by the time he finished the railroad in 1912, including a 7-mile bridge from Marathon down to the Lower Keys, the newspapers were calling it the 8th wonder of the world. Henry Flagler would be the first tourist to arrive in Key West by train in October of 1912, 5 months before he fell down the stairs of his mansion that resulted in his death. This particular extension from Homestead to Key West would finally be destroyed by the most powerful hurricane ever to hit the North American continent. And that was the Labor Day 1935 hurricane that swept up through the Middle Keys with winds of over 180 miles an hour. It would destroy the roadbed of the railroad. It didn't destroy the bridges. They're still there. If you drive down to Key West, you'll still see Mr. Flagler's bridges right next to the highway as you're driving south. But it destroyed the roadbeds on the islands, drove the Florida East Coast Railway into a receivership, and they would end up selling that extension from Homestead to Key West to the state of Florida. But it cost Flagler $30 million to build. The state of Florida bought for $640,000. Best deal they ever made, because it is today US 1 going down to Key West. But when Flagler died, they took his casket, they put it on a train, and they brought it back up here to St. Augustine to this church, Memorial Presbyterian. Flagler had built this church as a memorial for his daughter, Jenny Louise Benedict, who had died of complications of childbirth in 1889. It was also designed by his architect, Thomas Hastings, and done in poured in place concrete using coquina as the aggregate, and what Hastings called a Venetian design. Flagler would be brought here for his funeral, and he is laid to rest today inside the sanctuary of this church. It's a beautiful church with some beautiful stained glass. I highly recommend while you're here, you go into Memorial Presbyterian and pay your last respects to Henry Flagler, the man that truly single-handedly built the tourist industry along the entire east coast of Florida from St. Augustine to Key West. As far as architect Thomas Hastings, he would become one of the renowned architects of the first half of the 20th century. He would be the architect of the Standard Oil Building in New York City, 26 Broadway. He's the architect of both the Russell Senate Office Building and the Cannon House Office Building, which are the offices for the United States Congress today. He's the architect of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C. at Arlington National Cemetery, and his masterpiece was the New York Public Library. But if you want to see his earliest works, the ones that he did when he was only 26 years old, you have to come to St. Augustine. And you can see them all from the gun deck of the fort. If you go up on the gun deck and look to the southwest, you'll see this green dome. That's Memorial Presbyterian Church where Flagler is laid to rest. Across the street from it, you'll see the two towers of the Hotel Ponce de Leon that Flagler built. It is today Flagler College. If you haven't gone into Flagler College yet, please do so while you're here. Just because it's got these big iron gates out front and it's a private school, don't think they want to keep you out. No, they want you to come on in. Walk in through those gates into this beautiful garden area that Flagler put in 1888. And you can stand up and look at this beautiful building that he brought to town. And you can walk into the lobby and see that gold dome with George Maynard's masterpiece mural. And guys, I tell you, if you're down on the south side of town and you need to use the restroom facilities somewhere, the men's room in the lobby is to die for. You'll feel like you've gone back in time 100 years. It's all white marble and mahogany. It's absolutely gorgeous. And my wife tells me the ladies' room is just as nice, except in the ladies' room, they have a very ornate fireplace to keep the Victorian-era ladies warm while they were powdering their noses. But across the street from it is the Alcazar Hotel. It's that tower there, and it is today the Leitner Museum. If you like museums, this is a very good one. Its name is the Smithsonian of the South. It was turned into a museum by a man named Otto Leitner, who was a publisher from Chicago, who did not go bankrupt during the Great Depression because he was not invested in the stock market. He was known as the king of hobbies because he loved to collect things. And when all of his rich and famous friends went bankrupt during the Depression, he bought up all their cool stuff and all their collections, and in 1947 came here to St. Augustine, suffered from tuberculosis at the time, saw this building, and it was a vacant building. He bought it for $150,000, turned it into a museum, and then he would die 3 years later and willed this to the city. So today it belongs to the city of St. Augustine, and it is also our city hall. But while you're here, I really recommend you go in through these beautiful outside gardens here into the courtyard gardens inside through the front doors, and see these beautiful gardens there. And it's also got an arcade of antique stores in there. And if you don't even if you don't want to go to the Leitner Museum, which you can do while you're there, one thing that you might want to consider is this. Remember the world's largest indoor swimming pool that I told you was there? It has since been drained, and today it is the Cafe Alcazar, where you can go and sit in the deep end and have a beautiful lunch with a piano accompaniment. Very good food, and you can just enjoy the ambiance of this hotel. A lot of the locals go there on Sunday after church. And then across the street from it is the Casa Monica that Franklin Smith built. All of them are right on the same corner. What I recommend that you do is, every store in town has one of these books. It's a tourist book with this map inside, a tourist guide map. Pick one of those up. They're free in front of every store. And when you look at that map, you see the fort here, and to get to the hotels, you can walk down St. George Street, or Charlotte Street, which is the brick road, or down Avenue Menendez, the bayfront. And when you get to the Plaza of the Constitution, where our cathedral is, just turn to the right, and you'll see them all on the same corner. The first one that you'll come to is the Casa Monica Hotel. Walk through some of the nice art galleries there into the lobby. Then you can walk across the street to the Leitner Museum directly across the street. Then come out the front and go through Flagler College. And then you can go out the back way through the carriageway on the background to Flagler College, and you'll see Memorial Presbyterian Church directly across the street. You don't have to spend a dime to go to these buildings. Flagler College does do tours twice a day, 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, where they'll take you back and show you the Tiffany stained glass and what was the dining room, but today's the cafeteria for the students. Imagine being a student at Flagler College and having priceless Tiffany stained glass all the way around the room. And they'll give you a bit more of a history of it. One other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is 2 blocks west of the city gates, which are right here, there's a Potter's Wax Museum. And they have a new outside exhibit. And it is an exhibit of a statue of Henry Flagler sitting on a park bench. While you're here, go have your picture taken sitting on the park bench with Mr. Flagler like the rest of us. That's the new thing to do here in town. But from those beginnings, each year we have over 750,000 people come to visit us here at the fort. Last year was actually over 800,000. We'd like to thank you for being part of the 750,000 that will come to visit us this year. We hope you have a wonderful time at our beautiful fort today and enjoy our lovely city this Easter weekend and National Park Week starting today. Thank you very much.